Right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome members, officers, and members of the public watching at home to this Finance, Audit and Risk Committee. Before the meeting starts, I would like to invite the committee member and scrutiny officer to take a roll call of officers attending online and to explain how proceedings will work.
Thank you, Chair. Can I confirm the following officers joining remotely can hear us and we can hear them? Georgina Chapman?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you very much. Any other officers? Thank you. If a member wishes to speak, they should use the speak button located on the microphone unit. Please wait for the Chair's invitation before you begin. When requested to vote, voting will be via the yes, no, abstain buttons on your microphone unit. Details of how members voted will be shown on the screens around the room, and the results will be visible on the YouTube stream. In the event of a tied vote, the Chair will have the casting vote. Are there any questions before we start the meeting? Thank you. I'll hand back to the Chair.
Thank you very much. Apologies for absence. I have received no apologies for tonight. Are there any that anyone has received otherwise? Okay. Moving on to item number 2, minutes from the meeting of the 8th of March 2023. I would like to propose that we take as read and approve as a true record the minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of March 2023. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Plater.
Normally I would second. I think the issue with seconding is that I think some of us on the committee are new and weren't present at the previous meeting, so don't feel it's right to second. I don't know if there is anybody here who was present at the meeting who would be willing to second at all. But if there wasn't, then you're happy, Chair, because I know that you were at the last meeting, then I will second. That's a long way round of saying, yes, I'm happy to second as long as there wasn't somebody else who was at the meeting.
Yeah, just to clarify, so you can propose and second if you weren't there. The idea is you're then not meant to vote on the item. So you can move the minutes for the vote. You're not voting on the minutes or the decisions taken at the meeting. You're seconding the accuracy of the minutes, and then you can abstain or vote however you want when it comes to the actual vote.
Fine. In which case I will second, Chair.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. In which case then, can we move to the vote, please?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Just one comment on made, please. Present. There's the names of people there. It has your name and it says Anne Cannon. I think perhaps we should put the word John before that.
Yes, indeed, Councillor Hone. I'd missed that. Yes.
It's a minor thing, but
actually, I've just noticed that it says Sean Nolan and Cannon, and then has John Cannon in full beneath it.
Yeah, perhaps the Cannon.
Yeah.
I thought perhaps it was some member of the clergy were here.
Thank you very much for that, Councillor Hone. Yes, indeed. I think that just needs removing there. Right. Moving on to notification of other business. No other business has been notified. Chair's announcements. In accordance with council policy, this meeting is being recorded and the recordings will be available to view on ModGov or via the NHDC YouTube channel. Members are reminded to make declarations of interest before an item. The detailed reminder about this and speaking rights is set out under Chair's announcements on the agenda. For the purposes of clarification, 4.8.23a of the Constitution does not apply to this meeting. Therefore, a member may leave the room during the debate and consideration of that item and be able to vote. However, please be mindful of the business on the agenda and wherever possible, leave at an appropriate point in the proceedings. Public participation. We have no public participation this evening. So we'll now move on to the annual governance statement. Pass over to Georgina Chapman to present.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay? Good. So this is the draft annual governance statement, or AGS, for the 2022 to 2023 year, and it includes an action plan for the 2023 to 24 year. The recommendation is for the committee to review and comment on the draft so that it can be finalised and brought back to committee for approval in September once the external audit has been completed. A copy of the draft will also be sent to the shared internal audit service, Ernst & Young as the external auditors, and the shared anti-fraud service, and will take into account any comments by those bodies prior to finalising the AGS in September. So just a bit of background for anyone that's new to the committee. The Local Audit and Accountability Act and the Accounts and Audit Regulations require the Council to conduct an annual review of the effectiveness of the system of internal controls and prepare an annual governance statement. The AGS must then be considered by members of this committee and approved in advance of the authority approving the statement of accounts. The Council will include the 2022 to 23 AGS with the statement of accounts when that is published. The AGS review of controls is undertaken against the SIPFA SOLAS framework. So that's the Delivering Good Governance in Local Government Framework 2016 edition, and any other SIPFA SOLAS guidance that's relevant. The framework incorporates 7 principles of governance, so principles A to G, and the AGS has been prepared following review and input by the leadership team, with details of systems and examples provided against each of those principles A to G. The leadership team also provide assurance statements. The AGS provides a conclusion that no significant governance issues have arisen during the 2022 to 23 year, and that the Council is satisfied that it has appropriate arrangements in place. The self-assessment therefore proposes an assurance level of substantial. There's an action plan at the end. So this year there are 6 actions. So number 1 is increasing uptake of ethical awareness training. So that's increasing both staff and member uptake of the anti-bribery and fraud awareness e-learning modules. Number 2 is reviewing and further developing a member training programme for commencement after the May 2024 local election. Number 3 is for the inclusion group to establish a procedure for developing recommendations and delivering these to the leadership team. Number 4 is develop greater scrutiny of performance against the gender pay gap action plan. Number 5 is to monitor trends and circumstances around the local government ombudsman complaints via the review of quarterly reports. And number 6 is implement the action plan once agreed with the relevant committees and cabinet, which is being proposed to overview and scrutiny and finance, audit and risk committees from June 2023. So that's the gist. And then, you're being asked to review and comment on this in draft form. So then we can bring it back to you in September with the finalised version.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Are there any questions at all from members? John Cannon.
Thank you, Chair. One question, please. I just wasn't quite clear on which pieces of the content are going to be refreshed. You mentioned the external audit content, fair enough. Reading it, I can see there's references to going into lockdown in 2019. There's a review of the internal audit outputs from 21 and 22 years. Just to clarify that those also will be refreshed when it comes back in September.
Hi, John. Yes, we can. We had a bit of a conversation about this already. Because there were some bits which, we felt we could now probably take out. So we're happy to do that as part of the refresh and kind of keep it as brief as we can. So we'll literally do that as part of the refresh.
Councillor Hone.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just a question. You mentioned 6 items that are of importance. I'm trying to find those on the papers. Could you tell me what page they're on, please?
Yes. It's the so if you're on the AGS draft self-assessment 2022 to 23, which is the kind of longer document with the graphic on the front, the coloured wheel, and it's right at the bottom of that document. It's the document with the 3 columns.
Page 29. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Just in response to John Cannon's question, I was also going to point out that I felt the annual governance statement should reflect the 22-23 annual assurance opinion. I can see why it hasn't been included because I'm only presenting it tonight in the next agenda item, but it would be good practice to make sure that our annual assurance opinion aligned with the annual governance statement. I was also just going to point out for new members' benefit that what the annual governance statement is a key piece of the key paragraphs in there around the review of effectiveness of your governance arrangements. And one of the key parts of knowing whether the governance arrangements are effective is internal audit's annual assurance opinion. So hence I feel doubly strongly, I guess, that the two should align. So they're talking about the same year. Thank you. I hope that's clarified that one.
Ian Cooper.
I just wanted to clarify something on the recommendations, and this purely comes about because of all the different years of external audits we're in. Whilst we are hoping to approve some accounts at the next meeting, that will be the 21-22 accounts because we are almost over a year behind on those because obviously to approve a version of them at the meeting in March. There have been some changes since, which we're going to bring back to committee in September. So, but this document, this annual government statement relates to 22-23. So it'll be appended to the 22-23 accounts when we get there. Being realistic, that is likely March when that is finally had its audit concluded. So in terms of the recommendation there, I would propose that we change it so it says be finalised for approval in September rather than having the reference to the external audit and the statement of accounts because they are in effect the wrong year. And I don't want anyone to get confused about which year is which. So if we just put September, the legislation says that the annual government statement has to be approved before the statement of accounts. That can be 5 minutes before, or it can be 5 or 6 months before. I think it's good to get the AGS done so it's current and in place and approved. So doing that in September makes a lot of sense rather than waiting for the external audit finally to happen, which is outside of our control. So I probably can't propose amendments to a recommendation, but if a member of the committee wanted to, I think it'd make more sense and be a better way of presenting it.
Councillor Hone.
I can support the position which Ian comes up with. Question 21-22 accounts. Perhaps committee could be made aware why there's sort of a delay, a significant delay in producing those accounts.
Yes, so those who met on the committee last year will know that the audit of them started in November, which is later than it should do, but is symptomatic of the post-COVID recovery in relation to external audit resource. We had our draft accounts last year published in good time, but the delays are there. We were just about to approve them in March, and members of the committee who were there in March will know that we took a report there with the draft audit opinion from Ernst & Young at that point, and there were a couple of minor outstanding issues. And we hope to delegate to the chair at that point the final approval. Unfortunately, since that point, it has come to light, and I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible because it's horribly confusing, that the triennial valuation on the pension fund happens every 3 years, and that was carried out for the period up to March 2022. That was done during last year, and the results of that were published and given to us in around about January. Now, usually that would come after the statement of accounts have been approved. Because the statement of accounts got delayed, it came afterwards. And to add more problems to it, there was a big difference between what that said in terms of the final pension fund results as at the end of March 2022, compared to what's basically an interim report we have done every year to do the accounts from. If you have events after the end of March of any accounting periods, but before the statement of accounts have been approved, audit have to consider whether they need to then go back and look at the accounts. We are now in this cycle whereby these big differences are being investigated by a further audit of the pension fund. And until that's completed, they can't conclude the audit of our accounts. So that means, therefore, we can't file the audit accounts until that's happened. I'm hoping that work will be completed very soon, because it's also, as I'll come on to later, have knock-on effect on producing our 22-23 accounts. And my huge hope is that by September, which seems ridiculously late, but the best we can hope for, we'll be able to approve the accounts then for the period that ended in March 2022.
I'm just going to quickly pass back to Councillor Hone to respond to this point.
I guess the question is, that those 21-22, the pension arrangements there, will they have an impact on our numbers in terms of our revenue account? If not, I can understand why, because it is pension, but perhaps you can explain to the committee why, if it does and if it doesn't.
It has no impact on our general fund balance, which is the kind of the key metric around basically how much money we've got. In terms of pensions, we are required in kind of the impact on our general fund to show the contributions into the pension fund in year. We then, in the account, show the essentially actuarial valuation, but then all those numbers get reversed out again. So it has no impact on the actual important numbers in the accounts, albeit all numbers in the accounts are important. But in terms of that key metric, it has no impact, but it is required for proper accounting purposes.
Thank you, Chairman. The committee knew that. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. Pass back over to Chris quickly.
Thank you, Chair. Assume that's come on, yes. Just more generally, I probably should have made the point earlier. The annual governance statement is one of the key principles underpinning it, or a good annual governance statement, is transparency. And although there are no significant governance issues reported in this item, it's always nice as the internal auditor and the independent person, if you want to see that there is an action plan. We do see authorities who don't declare any action plan, and I don't feel they're being transparent around some of the issues the council faces. I think it's quite important to be transparent, and hence it's pleasing to see an action plan as part of the annual governance statement. When we were talking in the training earlier around sort of questions to ask and things, it's one of the things you'd always expect to see is not whether there's an underlying issue or not, but whether actually the council has plans to address these. And it's quite nice to see a good action plan and adherence to transparency.
Councillor Plater.
Thank you, Chair. My question also is about the action plan. I'm wondering whether this committee will receive updates on the progress of the different points of the action plan throughout the year. Obviously, point 6 has Finance, Audit and Risk Committee to monitor, and point 5 states that it has quarterly reports, but there doesn't seem to be any specific reports written into the plan for points 1 to 4, and I wondered whether that would be happening and what frequency we'd be receiving those if we are. Thank you.
That's a good question. I don't know if you'll be receiving regular updates on the plan, but I presume that we could make that so. So I can go in and check that if that's something that the committee would be interested in.
Ian?
Yeah, generally do a half yearly review. So you get, in this case, you'll get report now, we'll probably be part of the final in September, also do another update on that. And then usually probably in about March, which will be then 6 months after that, you then get another update as well. So you will get updates on it, yes.
And Chris.
I keep coming in on this item and mine's next, but I do write the annual governance statement for other authorities. So I was only going to say that was bearing in mind the training we had beforehand was a particularly good question. And at a number of other authorities that we go to, there is an update usually around December, 6 months into the year, just to tell the committee what the progress was against actions. So I would endorse doing that as a piece of good practice. It's not a requirement in any regulations. The AGS is a requirement of accounts and audits regulations and being part of the accounts, but I just think it's a good piece of governance to do that and to report back on it.
Thank you very much. Is there any other questions from any members at all? Okay, I think in which case, I think taking the advice received then for the recommendation, it will remove as soon as possible and insert in September. Is that the correct wording?
Yeah, if you delete everything from as soon as possible onwards and replace it in September, I think that would be fine.
Thank you very much. Can I have a proposer, the recommendation, please? Thank you very much, Councillor Hone. And the seconder? Thank you very much, Councillor Thomas. Is there any debate at all from members? Okay. In which case, can we move to a vote then, please?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you very much. Right, move on to item number 7, SIAS Annual Assurance Statement and Internal Audit Annual Report 2022-20.
That vote then was on the amendment that was proposed by Councillor Hone and not on the agenda item, I believe. So we should still need to vote whatever the recommendation is on the actual agenda item as amended.
Yeah, so I took it that Councillor Hone had proposed on the basis of the amendment that we made.
So he rolled the amendment and the vote on the into just one item. My bad. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, right. Sorry. Item 7 is the SIAS Annual Assurance Statement and Internal Audit Annual Report 2022-2023. This is Chris Wood to present.
Thank you. Feel I've participated already, but I think I'd better do introductions just quickly. Formally, I'm not sure I've met Councillor Tandy before, but informally to Councillors Thomas and Plater, I introduced myself before the training. I'm Chris Wood, the Head of Assurance at Hertfordshire County Council. In my day job, I'm also currently covering as the Internal Audit Manager or the Chief Auditor for North Herts Council. So that's overall the shared internal audit service fall under my broader remit. I'd also just say I've got a relatively new pair of glasses and I can't see if I look at you like that. So you might find me peering over the top of my glasses at you. I think bearing in mind the training beforehand, I had an idea of what I might want to say on this report, but I'm going to change it as I go along to sort of try and explain what it is and why it's here, if that's helpful to at least some members of the committee. So during the course of the year, we produce, as Ian mentioned earlier, there's an annual audit plan, which comes to you in March. It sets out our work for the year. During the year, you get progress reports on how we're doing against that plan. You get copies of the audits coming out of the plan. And at the end of the year, the public sector internal audit standards require me to give an opinion based on the work in that plan. So every individual audit has an assurance opinion, and there's an appendix in this report which explains some of the opinions. I was going to say all of the opinions, but as was pointed out to me earlier, there's a couple of opinions missing around a couple of definitions missing because the table is a table from the previous year. But what I have to do is take all those opinions from all the individual audits and give you an overall opinion. So the first primary thing to report in this report is the fact that I've given North Harts reasonable overall assurance across the audit work conducted. And you might go, wow, that sounds underwhelming. What it really means is that you're probably in it means you're in one of the top 2 categories. There are only 4 categories in our sort of scoring, if you want. Very few authorities, if any, are going to have a substantial overall assurance opinion, which is the highest. That's almost impossible with the way local government, unfortunately, and the difficulties and challenges it's experiencing. It is reassuring to you, though, that this is not a council that has Section 114 notices, statutory recommendations, best value reports, inspectors coming in, and authorities in that boat, I won't name them, but they're well publicised in the press, would likely have limited or no assurance opinion at all in some cases because the audit team haven't been able to deliver any work. So the reassurance to you is that North Harts are in a good category. Having reported on that bit, I've got a few set pieces within the report I need to go to. They're required by they're required by the standards. So one of them is to note the outcomes of our self-assessment against the public sector internal audit standards. So every year I have to self-assess against those standards and report to the outcomes. And I've self-assessed us as generally conforms, which is the highest category. And you could easily ask me, well, of course you would self-assess yourself as the top category. So what the standards require is that every 5 years, we have essentially an audit of ourselves and an external assessment is done. And the last external assessment was in 2021. And that concluded that we were generally conforms, which is the highest category. So that gives assurance to you as the committee that you have an internal audit service that is meets the standards and is delivering what the council would expect from it. One of the other things in here that I need the committee to approve is the SIAS Internal Audit Charter. This is essentially our constitution, if you want. It sets out our rights and responsibilities. And the approval of the committee for the coming year of that charter is quite important in terms of establishing our profile, your support for us, and essentially as part of your role in the broader governance structure. And the last thing I have to confirm to you is that there is nothing that I can find the exact wording before I've been talking off the top of my head, as I said, rather than what I planned to say, but I get the wording for you. I'm supposed to confirm to you that there've been no limitations or restrictions on the scope of our work. That confirms from me to you that no one, or that I have been able to maintain my independence. And at this point, and for minuting, if I can, I need Ian to confirm from management's point of view, likewise, that there've been no restrictions on the scope of our work. It is one of the requirements I've got on the cover of the report. So if I could just pause there and ask Ian to do that for us.
I am very happy to confirm to the committee I and management in general have not sought to limit the scope of internal audit and indeed have actively encouraged them to look into things. So I can confirm what was requested.
And I believe, thank you, Ian, that I've covered everything I wanted to. Probably take any questions, Chair, from there.
Thank you, Chris. Councillor Plater.
Yeah, just two for me at the moment. The first was I noticed on here in Appendix A that the individual audit for the parking strategy was cancelled. And do we know why an audit was cancelled and didn't take place on that particular item? And has that affected the overall opinion?
Just wait for my light to come back on. Thank you. You're making me cast my mind back. It's we report all, so to speak more generally, first, if I might, we report all changes to the audit plan to this committee. We're required to do that because although the plan is put together between us, between management, it's the audit committee that approves it for the authority. So whenever an amendment is made, it does come through the committee. I went with the general answer first because I'm trying to think back what the reason for the cancellation of the parking strategy one was. I'm trying to think whether it was deferred into the next plan, but it wasn't an area of particular risk. In a risk-based plan, you want audits of the highest risk, basically around your risk register and things, and the parking strategy was likely replaced by something of higher priority or higher risk. I'd probably have to look back through the previous progress reports to this committee, but it didn't affect the overall assurance opinion. And I and management, I believe, I won't speak for Ian, but don't believe we were being pushed away from anything. It's sometimes it might boil down to the fact that it couldn't be resourced then, or a strategy wasn't quite ready at the time the audit was due to go, so it gets replaced by another project. But I'm happy to go back and look through the reports if you'd like me to write to you after the committee. And
could I bring Ian Cooper in very quickly? I think he wants to raise something on this.
Yeah, my memory is that we had plans to do a new parking strategy, and due to other priorities, hadn't done one. It wasn't crucial we did one. The audit was due to take place on the new parking strategy. Without a new strategy, there's no point auditing it. So that's why it's been deferred. And I believe it is taking place next year, but subject to me and Chris confirming that, I think that's the position we're in.
Yes, I think you had another question, Councillor Clayton.
It's fine. It's on the audit charter point 5.2 on the authority and confidentiality. Obviously, it's implied by the wording in the audit charter, but it doesn't state specifically for political gain under where it would say be contrary to law for personal gain. Obviously, it's implied in there that it would be for personal gain, but I wonder whether it would be appropriate to include that in there, or whether it's sufficiently covered by the current wording.
Just reading 5.1 as well, if I might, which just to read the broader context. But yes, it's certainly true that we would certainly not use any information in a political context at all. We do have a right to any information required for any audit. We don't ask for any information that wouldn't form part of that audit. It's important that we have access to all documentation required to complete our audits. That's part of the concept of transparency and being able to give you an opinion on something. We couldn't do so if we didn't have access to information. It's certainly required in my contract as a senior officer at Hertfordshire County Council that I hold no overt political affiliations in any way, shape or form when conducting my work, and I oversee the teams that deliver the audits, so I'm ultimately responsible for that. For me, the key in there is that there's nothing that is kept away from me or my teams when we have an audit to do, so long as that's conveyed in there adequately. But I'm happy to amend if members felt strongly about that. It's a small amendment. So.
I think, yeah, if we want to raise that again during the debate, we can consider that then as part of that. Councillor Hone.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chair. 3.9, they say, I was pleased to see there's no critical recommendations, which was very good. Well done, officers. 4 high priority recommendations are made within work carried out during 2023, which was climate emergency, business continuity planning, risk and performance management, and care line. Would officers like to comment where we stand on those recommendations? Page 38, 3.9. Just list down. There you go.
This is going to be a bit from memory. Climate emergency was around resource for climate emergency. Members agreed as part of the budget process to put additional resource for the forthcoming financial year in relation to that. 2 of the others are in my area. I've just forgotten off the top of my head at the moment which ones they relate to, and I don't know what the Caroline one was. I will do a written response back to the committee around progress on those. And it certainly forms part of the regular reporting to the committee to let you know what's going on with high priority recommendations. It's just not off the top of my head at the moment, but I'll do an interim report to you by email, but I will also make sure that the next time we do an audit update, we cover that as we would do usually.
Chris?
It was only to come in on a point of practice. In my progress reports to this committee, I usually report on how we're doing against those high priority recommendations. I also know that members have access to Pentana, I believe it is, to also take a look if they wanted to, but some of those recommendations won't have hit their target dates yet, although naturally one would presume that action is taking place against them in the meanwhile ahead of that date. But I suppose the reassurance from me is that part of my regular progress updates, and certainly at the next committee, you'd find a table in our reports that sets out what that recommendation was and what the current actions are.
Thank you all. Are there any other questions from members? So the recommendations are for the committee to note the annual assurance statement and internal audit annual report, note the results of the self-assessment required by the public sector internal audit standards and the quality assurance and improvement programme, approve the SIAS audit charter for 2023-24, seek management assurance that the scope and resource for internal audit were not subject to inappropriate limitations in 2022 to 2023. Can I have a proposer for the recommendations? Councillor Plater.
Yeah, happy to propose, Chair.
Thank you. And seconder, please.
Second.
Thank you, Councillor Hone. Is there any debate? Councillor Plater.
Sorry, that was me.
Not a problem. Any other debate from members at all? Okay. If not, can we move to the vote, please?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to item number 8. This is the revenue budget outturn 2022 to 2023. Pass over to Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. Can I start off by asking members to refer to the addendum version of the report in your packs, please? Not as a big difference, but was one minor difference in there. So if I could start with that version, that would be really good. This is the end of year, so the end of the financial year running from the 1st of April 2022 to the 31st of March 2023. This is the revenue budget outturn report, so what's actually happened during the year. and revenue being the spend on day-to-day items, running costs, service contracts, and the like. The key highlights from the report, in terms of the overall position, if I flick through all the way to the report to table, table 7, gives you the general fund impact. That is the overall impact on the sort of main reserve the council has, and that number increasing means that overall we have greater resilience to the future, and that can happen through decreases in spend against budget, and also where our collection fund, which is the amount we collect through council tax or business rates, is greater than we expected as well, and also through transfers to or from reserves. So you'll notice in that table that the movement in this last quarter has all been the result of spend being lower than we forecast it would be, and therefore that exact same amount is therefore an increase in the general fund balance compared to the position we were forecasting as at the end of the third quarter. The detail of what's gone on to make up that is contained within table 4. You'll note lots of different movements and lots of different reasons provided for those. Picking up the key numbers from there, the £920,000 movement in the variance in the current year is captured in the 4th column along. Of that, 184,000, which is the 6th column along, is amounts we are looking now to spend in next year, because they're like specific projects that we have plans for this year, but will now take place next year. So therefore, you set the sort of net of those two numbers really to know the overall impact of that underspend, because that's going to increase the budget for next year and increase the spend next year. But also in the final column there, we have got some underspend in this year, so spending less than we forecast, that will continue on to future years, and therefore that creates in this case, a underspend in future years as well. There's a combination of over and underspends in there, but the net is a net underspend, i.e. decrease in spend in future years. The biggest one of those is on page 7 of the addendum, and relates to the contribution to overpayments in relation to housing benefit and the bad debt provision on that, which is £250,000. Carrying on through the report, there are various sections in there which try and highlight kind of anything that might be hidden within kind of some of the sort of summarized movements. So paragraph 8.3 looks at the impact of carry forward the budget from the previous year, and where we've got to with those. The idea being that if you carry forward budget from one year to the next, you should be spending it. There are a few examples where that hasn't happened and where there's a request for a further carry forward into next year. And 8.4 is quite a key paragraph in terms of when we set budgets, there will be a combination of planned efficiencies that we're looking to achieve during the year. And whilst important overall that we meet the budget, it is also important that we know where we're going with those planned efficiencies or planned reductions in spend or increases in income, to know if we've actually achieved them on an individual basis, because that gives us an insight into whether our forecasts were good in terms of setting the budget. If we've got good forecasts and good budget setting processes, it means we have greater reliability on achieving those in future years, and there's good in terms of the budget setting process we go through. We then follow that up looking for paragraphs now, sort of 8.6 through to 8.8, the key source of income for the council. And so there's the big numbers in those amounts of income, where it's led by demand. We've got those there, both in terms of the actual projection against the original budget, but also some supporting data in table 6 around some of the key stats that support those. Paragraphs 8.9 through to 8.16 then cover the impact of collection fund, which relates to how much business rates and council tax we've collected compared to budget, and the flow through all that information. There generally is a delay between the impact of that and the impact on the accounts, but that's explained in the paragraphs there. And then because this is an end of year report, we've also got in paragraph 8.18 the final position in terms of other reserves. So The general fund reserve is a key reserve. It is the main reserve we've got in terms of supporting future spend, but earmark reserves are also there and important in terms of specific money set aside for particular purposes. Some of that money is set aside by choice because we know we've got a purpose to use it for in the future. We want to set aside for that purpose. In some places in there, it is money that has been given to us for a particular purpose, particularly grant money, and which is required we spend it on that purpose, and therefore we put it in reserve to keep it set aside in the right place. So that is a summary of what the report shows. This is a report that is going to Cabinet. So your role as Audit Committee is to provide insight and questioning on the report, to provide any important information you think Cabinet should be aware of before they consider it next week.
Thank you very much, Ian. Turn over to questions from members now. Councillor Hone.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Interested in the one that jumped out at me was the contribution to PCM for bad debt provision, £75,000, £24,000. Our collection of parking penalty notices then, it seems to me is quite significant in terms of those non-payers as a percentage. We see the 162, 573, etc. So it does seem as though that's significant. Is that drastic versus previous years in terms of the amount of non-payment of parking fees, parking penalty notices?
I wouldn't say it was drastic. I would say it's higher than usual, higher than we're forecasting, but I think can be explained by the overall value. But I think probably is worth me doing some work around looking at the percentages, comparing that across years and providing that as information to the committee.
Okay.
John Cannon.
Thank you, Chair. On the parking notices point, I had a similar observation. I just wanted to clarify, do you have a view, please, on whether any of that debt was actually recoverable? I mean, in theory, revenue can be created by issuing a parking ticket, regardless of how likely it is to be paid. So, rhetorical question may be, how much of that potential revenue is realistic anyway? Which brings me to a second point, a theme of realism in the budget setting. I think the paper highlights a number of things that are fluid, rules changing on grants, government funding, fluctuating. I just wonder, do you expect to see more or less stability in these sources of income going forward in the coming years, particularly in view of the savings that the council is looking to make over the next 5, 6, 7 years?
So in terms of the PCM point, I don't think there's an issue around us issuing PCNs frivolously, but it is worth keeping in mind in terms of percentages that are required to be written off. Obviously, no one wants to pay a PCN, that I think goes without saying, but we do try and vigorously chase them before we write them off. And we would credit them if they were not realistic in the first place, if they're registered incorrectly, rather than writing them off. Writing off implies that we are happy it was a valid debt that is owed to us, but we just have exhausted all prospect of realistically chasing it. In terms of the point around sources of funding, it's going to be there's a lot of uncertainty in relation to funding. In terms of the level of core funding we can expect to receive in future years, there is some reliability over council tax. We know what our council tax base is, and we know reasonably what we think it might go up by, and the number of properties that are paying council tax. We have a fair idea about what government will let us increase council tax by, be that 2%, £5 or 3%, depending on the way the legislation is going in that particular year. It is the other source of funding that comes from government in terms of retained business rates. That's the high uncertainty. And things like new homes bonus in terms of the additional income on grants on top of that, which are kind of those core bits of funding we get. We don't know where that's going. We have vague ideas. And then on top of that, we then get the specific grants, which come out for particular purposes. Sometimes those are aligned to what we're going to do anyway. Sometimes they're not. And therefore, in those cases, they could be very good things to be doing, but they don't actually help the general kind of funding position for us. They just create more work. It could be good work in a good way, but yeah, it is more officer time spent on delivering what the grant priority is instead of what the previous priorities might have been. So short answer, we are no more certain about future funding than we were when we set the budget back in February. And we might still be in that same place by the time we get to February next year around a lack of certainty in relation to where we're going. And I'll reiterate what we said, the budget in February, inflation is still high. Our funding is not keeping track with it. And therefore that in itself, even without any cuts to our funding in terms of actual numbers, is creating real pressures for us.
Councillor Plater.
Thank you, Chair. On the leisure centres management fee on the table 6, the percentage movement on that is obviously sort of wildly out of kilter with the other percentage movements on the rest of the table. Now, I'm assuming that's down to a pickup from COVID and people returning back to the leisure centres. But moving forward, are we expecting this to sort of settle at around this number, or are we perceiving there will be sort of perhaps more swing than we would like? And how does that affect the financial health and the risk of it? Because obviously looking at that plus 70% is absolutely fantastic, but are we going to be looking at minus 30% the next time we come round, and that becoming a risk again, or more of a risk?
No, that reflects COVID recovery, and it's going to be sort of a curve. So it's, quite a drastic increase across the year from 21, 22, 22, 23, as we've gone through the kind of recovery from COVID. It will start to take level off. There is only so much capacity in leisure centres and so much demand that we can sort of re-tap into post-COVID recovery. We are expecting currently, forecast is that in terms of table 5, our outturn for 23-24, the current year, we're back in line with the management fee. So whereas in previous years we've been supporting the contractor on an open book basis, we're expecting to be back to them paying a full management fee, and therefore on that basis we will be back to, in inverted commas, normal, but a sort of a different peaks and different troughs. Areas like swimming lessons have recovered really, really well and actually higher than they were pre-pandemic. Areas like fitness are still probably not quite at that same level, so in the 90% of where they were pre-pandemic. So it's a combination of things, but I think we're settling during this year. We will settle back at a new normal, to use that horrible phrase.
Councillor Hone.
Perhaps to aid clarity to members, perhaps you could say what DLUHC stands for.
Yes, that's the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and the various guys it's going to be for. So they give us various grants in relation to business rates with flood reliefs and other things, and that goes into a reserve because that eventually needs to be offset against the collection fund. But yes, that's the government department, and we probably should put it in full rather than using that abbreviation.
Thank you. Understand what it stands for.
Thank you, Councillor Hone. Are there any further questions at all from members? John Cannon.
Thank you. Without labouring it, I just would like to ask the question about the delta between the original budget and the revised outturn that we're looking at today. The 18.2 million original compares with 15.8 now. It's 2.4 million. The reasons are set out in the pack. Do we have a view, please, on whether that sort of delta is expected to continue in future years? Appreciate it's a little bit similar to my previous question, but seeing the numbers on the page, I'm tempted to ask the question.
No, I don't expect that to continue in future years. a big part of that was the fact we set aside quite a high budget in relation to COVID recovery. And we haven't had to use all of that budget. Things like leisure performed a lot better than maybe we were forecasting. Some of those expenditure in relation to COVID have come back to normal more quickly than we were expecting. Yes, historically, we have generally seen some reasonably high differences between budget and spend being lower than the budget. But the fact we can explain them is a good thing in terms of we're doing the right things. There probably are some still very small pockets of areas where there's probably budget that could be removed, but very, very small pockets. And generally we can explain why the events have happened. But yes, we'd expect in future years that delta to be reducing by quite a lot, particularly as funding bites and we have to find more and more savings. Those savings are going to have to be more and more difficult to achieve in that situation, then looking at risks of overspends, i.e. not being able to achieve those savings rather than overachieving those savings.
Thank you very much. So the recommendations are that the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee recommend to Cabinet that Cabinet note this report, that Cabinet approves a decrease of 920,000 in the 2022-23 net general fund expenditure as identified in Table 4 and paragraph 8.1 to a total of £15.818 million. That the Cabinet approves the changes to the 2023-24 general fund budget as identified in Table 3 and paragraph 8.3, a total £47,000 decrease in net expenditure. Can I please have a proposer? Councillor Plater.
Happy to propose, Chair.
And a seconder?
Happy to second, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Is there any debate from members at all? No debate, in which case could we move to the vote, please?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you very much. Move on to item 9, investment strategy, capital and treasury, end of year review 22-23. Pass back over to Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. This is as you said, the capital and treasury report. So capital being the spend on items that have a useful life of more than 1 year. So both the acquisition and improvements to buildings, property, and things like that. And it also covers treasury, which is where we invest our surplus cash to, in some ways, get the best interest we can. But we prioritise the security of that cash and liquidity of that cash first. The security means we invest it in places where we expect to get the money back at the end of it, and liquidity being we can get the money back when we need it. So we don't want them to pay it back for 2 years after they're supposed to, but pay it back when they're supposed to pay it back. So we prioritise these two first and then look at the yield afterwards. And the Treasury strategy that Council set back in February for the coming year, but the previous February set the parameters for those investments, and we invest in terms of that strategy. So going through the report in order, table 2, starting on page 79, sets out where there have been changes in the timetable to schemes. A lot of these, probably all of them, are capital slippage. So capital projects intended to take place during the year 22-23, but have been moved because of timing into 23-24. So there's a lot of timing differences in there. Probably a little bit higher than I'd hope that total, in terms of we probably should have hopefully get better at kind of moving those some a bit quicker in terms of reporting them, rather than leaving right till year end to report on those ones. But I think all good reasons why they've slipped between years, but reporting on them earlier would be better in terms of financial planning. And then table 3, which is on page 82, sets out schemes where there have been actual real differences in the cost of this capital scheme versus the budget. In the case looking at there, all underspends, albeit that the first one is a bounds. It was fully grant funded. It just wasn't possible to spend the full value of the grant. So it had to be returned to government in that one. But the other ones are where we found different ways, particularly in the place of the St Mary's Lights, to do things, which have therefore made the cost a lot less. And then the last one is around the Muxwell places costing less than we had budgeted for them. Paragraph 8.6 sets out the capital schemes that are completed during the year. And then table 4 on page 83, quite important in terms of setting out how we funded that capital. So we still have capital receipts and set aside receipts that we are using to fund the capital programme. And in the year we have managed to sell some surplus land to increase the value of that. So the net reduction in that through the funding of capital has been to go down from 7.6 million down to 5.5 million. That capital will run out probably in the next 2 years, depending on delivery against the capital programme. And there is a limit of how much surplus land we have got. Not many bits of land left anymore that we are able to sell. And therefore we will move from a position to be able to fund from capital reserves through to having to borrow either internally or externally to fund our capital programme. In relation to treasury management, that starts on paragraph 8.10 on page 83. And it's probably worth just at that point sort of referring on to the appendix, which is the appendix B, which is the full treasury management update, which provides lots of detail about where we invested our money during the year. But the key headlines are that we have invested in line with the strategy. There've been no breach of the strategy, and the level of interest we've achieved, as you'd expect from the way general interest rates have moved across the year, has gone from a forecast very small amount of interest at the start of the year to much higher at the end of the year. So that's why, I guess going back to the question on the last one, John, around why the budget's moved by quite so much. Actually, over £1 million that movement during the year has been additional interest that's been achieved. And I certainly won't be banking that on there for an ongoing basis. Interest rates will hopefully, with a different sort of hat on, move back down again in the fairly soon to keep getting a bit more under control. So yeah, that is the report. Lots of detail, particularly in the appendices. Happy to take any questions that you might have. Again, this is a report that's going to Cabinet next week, so any comments are to be forwarded on to them to consider.
Thank you, Ian. Are there any questions from members? John Cannon.
Thank you. Just on that point about interest returns, does this little windfall affect the investment strategy, the position appetite for investments going forward, or do we treat it as an isolated windfall this year? Please.
In terms of the Treasury budget and the revenue budget for the actual income, we reflected in February in that budget, that setting that budget, what we thought the interest rate to be for this coming year, which was that they would peak and then come back down again. Obviously, the current economic news is they probably haven't peaked yet, unfortunately. So we will, at Q1, be reporting an increase in that projection, but still, in terms of longer term forecasts around where interest rates will end up, I think we have to assume that the inflation and therefore interest rates will come back to around about the 2.5% target in the medium term. So certainly wouldn't want to project forward on an assumption around 4% interest rates forevermore, particularly as we will move in the next couple of years in a position where we need to borrow to fund capital. And actually, that would be a bad thing in terms of funding capital if interest rates are still that high. So yeah, you gain with some and lose with the other, but it might be that we actually gain with both in terms of, in this particular angle, we will gain in terms of treasury income, and they'll come back in time for the fact when we need to borrow to fund new capital expenditure. But with the bigger picture for the council and our residents, we'd like interest rates to come down much quicker. given the pressure it causes for the people out there.
Councillor Hone.
Thank you. Question, waste and street cleansing vehicles. We have in there £4 million in 25-26. Does that mean we're assuming when the new waste contract is signed that we will have in there that we are going to provide the vehicles?
Both options in terms of whether the council or the contractor fund the vehicles are still on the table. We haven't made a decision on that yet. In any event, there is a requirement under accounting rules that we treat vehicles using a contract where we essentially have control how they're used, that we capitalise those purchases anyway. So whether we pay for them or the contractor pays for them, we're required to show as capital expenditure at the point that we gain the use of those vehicles.
Thank you.
Just one from me as well, Ian. In terms of the slippages we've seen on some of the projects that are being undertaken, are there any particular risks at all that have arisen that may affect them going forward, just in terms of things like the property investment, property improvements work in particular? Are there any sort of issues that have arisen there that concern us probably maybe beyond next year as well?
Property improvements is always a balance of risk. It would be lovely to be able to get a full list of condition surveys on our buildings and do lots of work on our buildings and bring them all up to a really good standard. Unfortunately, both finances and just officer resources and the amount of time we've got during the day do limit the extent to which we can do that for all buildings. So property improvements are always a kind of a balance of risk around prioritising those that are the most important. As well as to a degree doing the work at the right time. So where we've got external decorations of buildings, we do that in the summer. It makes no sense to do it in the winter. So it's always a balance, and therefore there's nothing in there that I'm exceptionally concerned about in terms of we've got buildings that I think are at risk because of the lack of property improvements. There are definitely buildings out there we could do more on, and we will seek to do that work. But there is always some risk in terms of all property improvements that it would be nice to do it sooner and do it to the gold standard, but we have to be realistic what we can afford and what we can resource.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from members? If not, the recommendation is that the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee recommend to Cabinet that Cabinet notes expenditure of £6.923 million in 2022 to 2023 on the capital programme, paragraph 8.3 refers. That Cabinet approves the adjustments to the capital programme for 2023-24 as a result of the revised timetable of schemes detailed in Table 2, increasing the estimated spend in 2023-24 by £1.222 million. That Cabinet notes the position of the availability of capital resources as detailed in Table 4, paragraph 8.7, and the requirement to keep the capital programme under review for affordability. That Cabinet approves the application of £6.3 million of capital receipts set aside towards the 2022-23 capital programme, paragraph 8.7 refers. Cabinet is asked to note the position of Treasury management activity as at the end of March 2023. And finally, Cabinet is asked to recommend this report to Council and ask Council to approve the actual 2022-23 prudential and Treasury indicators and note the annual Treasury report for 2022-2023. Any debate? Oh, no, before that, sorry, I need to first see if we have a proposer. Thank you, Councillor Thomas. And a seconder.
Happy to second, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Plater. Right, now, is there any debate from members? No. If not, can we move to the vote, please?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you very much. Councillor Plater.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Chair, whether it'd be possible to take a 5-minute break in proceedings at all.
We do have 3 items left. So yes, if members would like a quick break now, I think that would be an appropriate time to do it.
Thank you.
Councillor Thomas. Right, back on. We'll move on to item number 10, which is the LGA Review Action Plan. Pass back over to Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. So the council had a follow-up to its peer review, and the follow-up was focused on the effectiveness of both the Finance Audit and Risk Committee and the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. This report, as you expect, focuses on the Finance Audit and Risk Committee and the recommendations that that review came up with. This report and an equivalent one for Overview and Scrutiny will be considered by Cabinet, and they will then endorse the action plan, and then we'll seek to implement all the actions as set out in there. So the actions are set out in the table in paragraph 8.1. Some of them are sort of in progress already, and some of them have sort of fairly clear timelines attached to them. I will point out there is one in there, so I'm just trying to find, in relation to me drafting a form of words, which is on page 111, for the chair to read out for the first meeting of FAR in each civic year and onwards around the purpose of the committee, which I've actually missed doing. I put the target date for today on there, but I haven't actually done it, so I apologise for that, and I'll make sure it's put in time for the next committee. In terms of purpose, hopefully the training we had before the meeting for the members here, we're very clear about what the purpose of the committee is, but obviously for the public and for that wider audience to promote the role of the committee and its importance. It's important I get that done. So my apologies for that, and that will be a deadline will be amended to September for the next meeting. In terms of the other actions, I think the main one to note is around the action we're not taking forward. The peers recommended that we consider splitting the finance reports out from this committee and move to being basically an audit and risk committee rather than the finance audit and risk committee, albeit we still approve the statement of accounts as part of that governance requirement on there. But the revenue and capital reports and the budget reports will be taken out from this committee and be scrutinised by Review and Scrutiny Committee. The reasons that we have chose to currently not accept that recommendation is that, as the review quite right pointed out, the Overview and Scrutiny Committee is finding its feet and has kind of some development of its own to do. So it made no sense at this particular juncture to put more work onto it. Rather, it should probably stay with this committee and look at the expertise we already have in this committee in relation to those particular reports, as well as the other reports we have. Particularly, we have our independent member, and we also have one member of the committee who has been around the block and knows what he's talking about very well. So I think we should take advantage of that and consider how we use that in the short term, and then maybe next year think about whether we then separate those off. I can see pros and cons both ways. You have a lot of expertise in this committee as we develop the skills, but it is an area you could probably put more of a scrutiny on and put into Overview and Scrutiny at the same time. So as it stands, that's the recommendation in relation to that. Hopefully all the others are fairly clear in what we're planning on doing with them, and they've got deadlines attached to them. The only one that's currently missing a deadline is the last action, which is on page 113 at the bottom, is around making sure that everyone is more able to access information about council meetings. That's a tricky one to achieve, but I'm sure our community services colleagues will have a plan and think of something we can do with that. Even if it's just sort of promoting an Outlook and the magazines we already produce in paper format, just to kind of remind people that those things are there and they can access them. So before it goes to Cabinet next week, looking for comments and or endorsement from this committee as the actions proposed, given that although it does relate to you, it is your committee, and making sure happy what's set out there.
Thank you very much, Ian. Are there any questions from members? Councillor Hone?
Yeah, I think I can support that position that we don't change things at the moment. I think, yes, let's see what ONS come up to there, but the role of this committee, I think, has a purpose. And to mix and match and be selective around what over and scrutiny do in terms of scrutinizing certain things, whereas we are not scrutinizing. They scrutinize. So I think leave it as is for a while. We come back to it. As long as this decision is taken with influence from this committee and not by anybody else. In other words, if it comes up as a recommendation and says we are going to change it, at least we'll have give the chair of this committee the opportunity to give input into that, and perhaps members of the committee input into it as well. The pluses and minuses. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hone. Councillor Thomas.
A minor clarification about I was watching out for this report and wondering why it didn't come down to council, but it's saying it came to council in January, and it may just be that I missed it, but it's not on the agenda for the January meeting of council. So can I just confirm either now or afterwards how this report was originally shared with wider council? It's not urgent. It's just I was thrilled to be able to see this in the document pack for today, but it was something I've been watching out for a while.
Yeah, I'll have to come back to you on that outside of the
Great,
meeting.
thank you.
Any other questions at all from members? So the recommendations are that the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee recommend to Cabinet that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee comment on the draft action plan and refer it to Cabinet to be approved. Can I have a proposer? Thank you, Councillor Hone, and a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Tandy. Move on now to debate, if there is any. I think I would just like to say something at this point. I was involved in the peer review that took place, I believe it was early this year, when we had the call with the review peer with the peers that were involved. It was a little bit difficult, I think, from my perspective, being at the time brand new councillor and new onto the committee as well. I think the main point I really put in there was, again, it was primarily around understanding our purpose, our role, and just making sure that we were being effective as possible as councillors. And I think it's come out of this report, some of the actions, but to be honest, was being acted on well before that as well, last civic year, where officers were doing their very best to educate, to inform, and to make sure that we were as clear as possible on what it was we were supposed to do in this committee, and to make sure that we were doing the role. I think Councillor Hone, you referred to it there in terms of the responsibilities we have being a member of this committee. So I'm very pleased that already we can see completed actions against some of those recommendations. Again, thank you, Ian, as well, for your help so far in doing your best to train us up and make sure we are as prepared as possible to act as we should do, and very much looking forward to assisting along with other members putting in place that training plan going forward. Any other debate at all? Anything else to be added from members? Okay. In which case, can we move to the vote, please?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you very much. We will move on to item 11. This is the finance. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. The Finance, Audit and Risk Committee Annual Report. Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. So An important part of good governance is a audit committee that assesses its own effectiveness, and this is part of doing that. It is also reflects that the role of audit committee is to support council overall, and the support therefore gets referred to council, not cabinet, to help provide reassurance to council that this audit committee is acting effectively and providing good assurance and good governance and supporting good governance. This is backward looking. It looks back at last year and what happened in the last year, albeit that it does take an opportunity to think about what's happening in the coming year and to describe what planned actions are at the same time. It has in page 136, there's some bullet points there looking at the last time that SIAS carried out a review of the committee, which was in 2021, and it sets out the progress against the actions that are set out there, which have all now been achieved. The reason we didn't do a review last year and haven't done one this year either is because we knew about the peer review, sort of the LG review as set in the last report. So given that was happening, didn't see a point in sort of duplicating that. So therefore, that previous report kind of covers the review for the last 2 years, really, be given the sort of the time that review is taken and then considering the actions coming out of it. So therefore, we have reviewed it, but in a different way to usual. In terms of the content, the table in 138 sets out the various reports considered during the year. I've tried to sort of change the format for those who've seen it in previous years to look more kind of on themes, which hopefully makes it a bit easier to kind of interpret what's going on and sort of see the cycle of reports across the year and across the various themes the committee covers. In previous years, there's been a long list by meeting date of what's been covered at each meeting. Hopefully that might aid the reader a little bit. The section on page 139 sets out the main achievements during the year. Obviously, it's good as an audit committee, we do approve the statement of accounts each year. And we did manage to approve one set of accounts in the last year, albeit not quite the right year and the right one, but we did manage it. And it sort of talks about the change as a result of the council delivery plan and the role of overall scrutiny in relation to that. And also the fact that this now committee has an opportunity to sort of take a greater oversight on risk. And that's going to reflect in the reports coming up next around that, the look at risk from a more sort of hopefully more strategic perspective rather than getting involved in the detailed risks. I do mention there we have our new independent member who started in September, so during last year, and the role that is played by him, sorry. I think particularly pertinent during last year was we did take the opportunity to look at the council instruction scheme, which was a change and certainly provided some good insight from this committee into cabinet when considering the scheme. So I think that was a useful bit of work this committee did during last year. In terms of planned work, which is set out in the table of 140, and I will note there's an error in that title at the top of page 140. It should say planned work for 23-24, not 22-23. Getting my years messed up. That sets out where, again, we look to be during the year and the reports you'll see during the year across that kind of cycle and that regular review of what's going on. I do have to point out at the bottom of page 140, we should have by now, by the 31st of May, we should have published our draft statement of accounts for 22-23. We have not done so. And this links back to the issues I was talking about earlier about the pension position. We haven't been able to resolve the pension position for last year. And unfortunately, there's a knock-on impact in returns requesting a report to set out the position for 22-23. So the ongoing issue in 21-22 to 22-23. Everything else is done. We're ready to go with the accounts apart from that one issue. But to publish accounts which have, whilst doesn't affect the general fund balance, as we discussed earlier, it is some big numbers in the accounts and some big gaps that would be missing without it in there. I think is a mistake to do that. And also the accounts regulations require that we open the accounts to the public under a public inspection period once they're published, the draft accounts. To be fair to the public, if they do want to look at the accounts, they should be able to look at the best draft version we can give to them. So that is why I have delayed publishing the accounts. I appreciate, and it's flagged in the report, that therefore is a technical breach of the accounts and audit regulations. Our auditors are aware of what we're doing, understand what we're doing, and are supported in terms of statement on the website to that effect. We are by far from alone in that boat of not publishing by a deadline. I think our reason is a reasonable one. There are other reasons as well across the country around lack of resources and other reasons for not publishing on time. But I think it's important to flag that with the committee around that breach of the regulations. And by referring this report to full council, we will report to full council as well. I'm hoping to understand the reasons behind that and the reasons behind that decision that I've taken. So that's kind of, I suppose, the key bits from the report. And hopefully it's, for those that were part of the committee last year, it's a kind of useful reminder of what happened last year. And for those that are maybe new to the committee this year, it's hopefully some indication of what was coming in terms of the year ahead. So welcome any questions on the report and any comments about it, but you will prefer them to full council subject to your approval.
Thank you, Ian. Move to questions now. Councillor Plater.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Obviously, the breach in the regulations has happened for a reason that's entirely out of our control. But are we likely to receive any financial negatives or fines or any sort of punitive action for having breached those regulations at this time?
No, there's no punishment in the regulations around any fines or anything similar to that. The only impact could be, I suppose, reputational, but hopefully by clearly explaining why we've done it and what the situation is, hopefully that will be avoided. I think it's not it's not political. It's nothing to do with that. It is just a kind of a technical reason and a technical outcome coming out the back of it. I am keeping on top of the progress that Ernst & Young are making with the pension fund audit that's the reason I explained earlier, and I am hopeful that they can complete that as soon as possible, and I would hope to be in a position by the end of July to be publishing our draft set of accounts. I will do that before we've approved the old year accounts, as in the 21-22 accounts. But as soon as I get to say about which audit report, which pension fund report I can use, and then would hope to look at in September, I can bring the accounts for 21-22, as in the old year accounts, back to this committee to finally get those approved, and then hope that by next year we can be a bit more on track in terms of approving accounts on a more timely basis, because it's in no one's interest to these accounts be dragging on for quite this long.
Councillor Hone.
Thank you, Chair. I guess because this is a report, Finance Audit and Risk Committee annual report, signed off by Councillor Tyler, can I assume that Councillor Tyler is happy with it?
He has been sent a copy. I will be contacting him again in advance of council to hope that he'll be able to send it to full council. But if he's unable to do so, we'll find a backup, which could be me presenting it to full council. But he has been sent a copy of it and been given a chance to comment on it, as has the current chair, who's been sent a copy in advance as well.
Just have his name on it, so it would be really, if he's going to put his autograph on it, he should be content. So for the benefit of this vote, can we assume that he is not discontented? Yeah.
I have not had him say discontent, so yes, I think that's about. I think you can assume that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hone there. Any other questions from members? John Cannon.
Thank you. An observation on page 140. It talks about the timetable for signing off the current year's accounts, I think, next March. I remember in a previous meeting, EY commented that there is a time lag where accounts are typically signed off a year after their accounting date, and they're hoping to shorten it, but it's outside the council's control. Please correct me if I'm wrong in that thinking. The other thing I'll just mention on a point of minor fact, on page 136, the first bullet point refers to my role and that I've attended each meeting since June 22. Actually, it was September. And elsewhere in the paper, it correctly references September. Thank you.
In terms of audit, yes, they are. Yeah, as you, for those who've been around for a while, will know that it is out of our control. It's down to EY resources, and I am hopeful that they will start the audit work for the 22-23 accounts in November of this year, and that should mean that, barring no kind of hiccups, it is completed by March to approve the accounts then, which then allows us to hand over to KPMG or BL new auditors. I would love to get it done by the end of March, so the 1st of April, so they'll be auditing this current year, but they can then start their work as soon as that year's finished on the 1st of April 2024, which puts us in a much better place in terms of handover than then that dragging on as well. And I will, yes, I note my error in terms of the consistency across the report, and that should be corrected and say September 22. So I think with that change will be what we'll refer to on full council. And the other error I highlighted in terms of the dates at the top of page 140.
Thank you. Any other questions at all? Okay. So the recommendation is that the committee consider and comment on the annual report of the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee as attached at Appendix A, that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee recommend to full council that the annual report of the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee be noted. Is there any debate? Oh, no. Before we go to debate, can I please have a proposer? No, that's a fair point. I don't know if there's any. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, happy to do that then. So I'm happy to propose the report from last year. Thank you very much, Councillor Hone. Is there any debate? No debate at all. So on the basis of the recommendation being proposed and seconded, and with the changes that were proposed by John Cannon and accepted by Ian Cooper, can we please move to the vote?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item 12, annual report on risk management. Pass back over to Ian Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I will take you through some of the highlights of the report. So I will start off by referring to the background section on page 144. So just to re-highlight that during the last year, and this is a report looking back at last year and risk management during the last year, we did change the way we look at risk. So the council delivery plan is now considered by Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and that looks at projects, performance indicators and risk in one report, which then allows Overview and Scrutiny and in turn Cabinet to focus on the detail and linking that detail together, and gives this committee a chance to focus on the way risk works and the risk and governance approach to it. And this report is part of that, as well as the mid-year report. I'll also highlight in paragraph 7.3, the council does have a risk and performance management group. There is a standing invite to the executive member as risk and performance member champion, and to the chairs of Overview and Scrutiny and of FAR, and also to any members of FAR or Overview and Scrutiny that wish to attend the meeting as well. If you're interested in attending, please let me know and I'll make sure you get an invite. I will note these meetings are during the day, so I know it's a barrier to attending, but if you're interested in attending, even if it's on a one-off basis, please let me know, and we'll get you an invite to at least see what goes on those meetings. It is a space that allows a more in-depth discussion around risk and does allow kind of us to sort of discuss various issues but all the results of that are reported back into the kind of more formal reports, but it does give that kind of wider time and space to look at these issues. So moving into section 8 of the report, I think we fast forward to the risk matrix, which is on page 147. That sets out the position at the end of the year on all the risks contained within the council delivery plan. And you'll see kind of a various space in the risks around the matrix. Some in the top right corner where we've got some higher risks. I think financial sustainability and balancing our budget will be a risk for a little while until we get some funding certainty, and know we're going with that. The government resource and waste strategy, also in the top right hand corner, still not been published, and it's getting more and more important. It does have an impact on how to procure our new waste contracts going forward, and it'd be lovely to have that, because will provide some potentially quite significant changes to what we do in relation to waste. And the other one in there is Churchgate, and obviously the acquisition of that during the last year, and now just kind of a plan about how we take that forward in terms of regeneration of that area. See a lot of interest, both from the people of Hitchin and more widely people who use that shopping centre, and the fact that it could require quite a lot of council resource to deliver a project, both in terms of money and people to do that. So that's right, it's in that top right hand corner. I'd also like to point out that we do have a general resourcing risk in the box labelled 8, which was introduced during the last year, and that has to reflect that it was initially put in there because of various works around cost of living and the back of COVID, but actually it's a general risk around the fact that we have made significant savings in terms of officer numbers over the years, and there are, I would say, as many projects before, but more projects than there has been in the council that we're trying to achieve, and therefore we have to reflect that. Whilst we try and make sure everything's resourced, we do rely on our people, and they are important to us. And particularly, we have vacancies in a lot of key roles in certain areas. It does provide a risk to us, so that is quite right. It's a risk there as well, and it's worth flagging every opportunity in relation to that one as well. There are obviously some good news in terms of our low risks in there, projects that are going smoothly and do have low risk attached to them, but I think it says risk report usually highlight the red ones rather than the green ones. The table at the top of 148, I think, is quite a useful table. It's a newish table that we've introduced into these reports, and I think it's good in terms of showing that risks do move around. It's important we use risk as a risk management technique. We should be looking at a risk emerging. We identify it, we assess it, we put in place some mitigations against it. And then those mitigations should be actions that we try to achieve to bring the risk score down. And therefore, we don't want risk to sit there doing nothing. We want the risk levels to change over time. And this table does provide some indication that is happening, which is a good sign. So I think that's a useful table to include in there. As I've just mentioned, in terms of the general risk matrix, 8.3.1 on page 148 does talk about the resourcing risk. And it also covers some of the other new risks that have emerged during the year, including Churchgate as well in that one there. I think it's worth highlighting in paragraph 8.5, my plug for Pentana. It is our risk management software system. It does give you guest stats as councillors. There's information on the internet, but I'll also circulate again by email the guest information for accessing Pentana. You can access it from any PC. Doesn't need to require you to log into an HDC PC to be able to access it. So do have a look at it. It does provide a useful tool to be able to drill down into our risks and have a look at them. Paragraph 8.7 covers our approach to kind of emerging risks. And also our risk appetite. It's important we set our risk appetite. We do declare we are risk aware, so we do take on board risks based on projects. Some projects will take more risk than others because of the outcomes we're looking to achieve. And also noting paragraph 8.7.3, this was a challenge that came out of the risk audit that took place around how we look at the unknown risks or the not so well known risks. So they're not providing a particular impact on us now, may not do in the short term, but may do in the medium term, and having a process in place to kind of think about identifying and considering those risks. So as you'll see in our program 8.73, we did do some work at that as part of the risk and performance management group, and looked at things like the war in Ukraine, the tensions between China and Taiwan, the conflict there, and the issues they could cause, both in terms of supply chain failure and issues with supply of kind of key things we may need. Which is sort of a direct impact on us. It's obviously as well as being concerned about the wider political impacts of those things. Inflation continues to be a risk as well, and the impact that could have on capital projects in the future, as well as on our revenue budgets now. Our plan is that we will use our senior management group, which is all of our managing director, our service directors, and all of the reports and service managers meet together on a quarterly basis. Use that probably every 6 months to look at those emerging risks and consider what are the things we sort of are aware of. We need to kind of start thinking about and having a plan in place to think about those as well, in terms of those going into the sort of formal risk management process. Continuing through the report, we do have sections that look at insurance, business continuity, and health and safety, and that's good practice to include those in terms of they do input into risk, and I'm not going to go into detail into them, but they are in their own report for you to look at. And then finally, we have got an action section in paragraph 13.1 around some target actions for the coming year, both in terms of risk training, looking at the risk management framework, and again, looking at the insurance tender, albeit that one has now been completed. So that's the report as set out in front of you. Are there any questions?
Ian, so I was going to ask a little bit around the risk awareness side. So obviously talking a bit there about how risk we manage, how it be identified. I was just wondering if there is any ability for the council to use, say, the risk registers held by, whether it's central government, other councils, similar sort of scale bodies, as part of the sort of risk development process, and whether that's been looked at yet, and if there is any connections already in place.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. So I think the best example of that is in relation to the Shared Internal Audit Service. We do get a lot of shared learning through that. They do cover 7 other councils across the district, so across the county, and therefore the learning they get from the audits they're doing on those, they do share. So if they find a particular issue in one council, they will share that in a where necessary confidential way around just making them aware that they found that issue there, and therefore something for us to be aware of. Equally, the Shared Anti-Fraud Service will also share risks that they find in relation to fraud, both from the work they do with other councils, but also they get a lot of work they get from national bodies in relation to fraud, and they'll share that learning as well. I guess in terms of your question around central government, that's probably an area where we maybe could do more on. Maybe that's an action for me to look at in terms of how we could use the risks that are facing central government to reflect on whether there's anything that applies to us as well. So I'll take that action to consider that as part of the next risk and fraud management group around how and if there's scope to use central government learning to provide greater insight into how we approach risk.
Any other questions from members? John Cannon.
Thank you. Question, please, on page 153. Paragraph 10.3 talks about reviewing resilience plans. And I'd just like to clarify, does that include looking at your resilience for North Herts in event of a key supplier being out of action? In some fields, resilience is taking on a wider meaning beyond just business continuity and so on, and looking at the ability to sustain your own operations if a supplier is not available. Whether that is IT supplier or indeed someone who provides another service that equips you to support your services to residents.
Yes, it should do. So yeah, the focus should be on what the key dependencies are around delivering our services. and what we would do if they were not available. So yes, that would include things like IT suppliers through to our waste contractor, leisure contractor. I think there's always learning to do in terms of business continuity. It's always an evolving thing around the various factors that could come into play. But yes, certainly the intention is that it looks at, if something bad happens, how do you recover from it, and what are the resources needed to get there. Do
we have any other questions from members? In which case, the recommendations are that the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee recommend to Cabinet that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee note and provide comments to Cabinet on the annual risk management update for referral on to full council, that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee provide comments to Cabinet on the review of the risk management framework, and that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee comment on the type of risk management training they would like to see going forward. Can I please have a proposer?
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. And a seconder, please.
Happy to second, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Plater. Is there any debate from members? If there isn't, then could we please move to the vote?
Chair, that motion is carried.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to item 13, possible agenda items for future meetings. So for this final item, this is really for any suggestions, recommendations from members at all, for any items to look at in future meetings. This can be anything really that relates to the activities of the committee in terms of finance, audit and risk and the role we play there. A lot of new members today, so maybe still settling in for many and understanding what you'll be doing here. But if there are any ideas, if not now, then for next time we meet, please do feel free to suggest things. We'll get it checked over to make sure it's within our remit, but otherwise happy to hear anything that members might want to put forward. Councillor Thomas?
I don't know if this is within scope, but I'd be intrigued to get up to speed, more up to speed from a financial risk perspective on some of the higher profile, more riskier projects. So Churchgate would be a prime example of wanting to sort of have some focused time on that, but that might be more in the training and skills, and that doesn't necessarily need to be, that could be a written resource. But I do think some kind of primer on some of those more sensitive projects could be very helpful from a FAR perspective.
Definitely think that would fit in with the role of the committee from that perspective. I wonder if, Ian, would it be possible for some of those higher risk items, potentially for whether it's by exception updates, if anything has changed, or just quarterly briefings, maybe, just if there is anything useful to be brought forward that relate to any of those areas?
I will have a think about how we achieve that without duplicating what OV and Scrutiny are doing, who do get the council delivery plan, which does have the key projects and progress on those. But I do appreciate that there may be elements of the risks associated with that you want to have an input into and have a kind of an insight into. So let me think about how I can present that either as part of a formal committee report or offline to achieve what you want out of that. Bearing in mind, you will also get the 6 monthly updates on risk, but I appreciate this does seem quite a long way away when you just have one report. So I'll think about how to achieve that and see what we can do.
Thank you, Councillor Hone.
Yeah, I just think, yes, support the position, of course, but the reason why I didn't wave the flag on it is because overview and scrutiny, I think it's on their agenda, a number of things which were mentioned. particularly around Churchgate, around those sorts of areas, were on the ONS committee agenda, so, or plan to be on that agenda. So we have to be careful here, because otherwise we're treading on toes, but also because it comes back to what we said earlier about the role of FAR versus overview and scrutiny, and how it falls in the gap. So just fair warning.
Yeah, I think, there's a fair point to make sure that, I think you're quite right, we don't start crossing over after that boundary. So, yeah, no, absolutely. Is there any other suggestions from anyone? Anything else at this point? If not, then the next meeting, I'll just make sure I've got the updated one. So currently the next meeting of FAR is scheduled for Wednesday, the 20th September, but it is likely this will be brought forward to Wednesday, the 13th of September. This will be confirmed with members as soon as possible. So do keep an eye out for that one. Other than that, if there's no other business, then thank you very much, everyone. And I bring this meeting to a close at 9:29.